Hello everyone, Rachel Weaver here. I have been making a series of videos in which I ask other Lighthouse faculty craft questions. So today, Erika Wurth has joined me. Thanks for being here, Erika.
Yeah, of course.
I am going to ask Erika some questions about revision. So the place I want to start is sort of, I'm interested in whether or not you have a process for revision with your fiction. I should also say that Erika has been on faculty for about 4 years at Lighthouse. She has 2 books of fiction out in the world and a book of short stories, collection of short stories, as well as 2 poetry books. So I'm interested in how you approach revision and whether or not that has changed over the course of your writing life.
I think I always accepted revision as, just what you have to do as a writer. You cannot, like any writer, sometimes I'm able to be like, oh, I'm getting these suggested changes and I'm overly sensitive about them. And other times I'm like, no, this is great. And we all kind of go back and forth with what we think is helpful and our emotional reactions to it. But, I feel it's necessary. In some ways, what's changed for me over the years is the front end of things and it ultimately does change my revision process because I will revise as I write. I am one of those guys, I've tried to stop, but I just can't. And then when I'm done with the chapter, oftentimes, or a short story for that matter, I'll go back and I'll revise before I keep going. And eventually I try to stop going all the way back to revise, right? So if you've got a 300-page novel, you don't want to every single day go all the way back. And then once I'm done with it, I try to find a peer after I've gone a few rounds of revision with it. I try to find a peer to look at it. And my problem and what I mean by things that changes me on the front end is I was extremely naive in my 20s, and I read a lot of really great essays by really brilliant folks who are academic fiction writers. And I really believed that the main thing was your characterization and your language, right? And that the plot, if you really took care of the characters, the plot would take care of itself, and you needed to do nothing more than brainstorm a bit and just start charging forward. And that was completely stupid, and I'm sad that I thought that. I really do wish that I had done what my boyfriend does, and he's of course a crime writer, so structure and plot are really imminent. But because I range from the experimental aesthetically when I do certain short stories to the more traditional narrative, I think, especially when I'm doing the more traditional narrative and I'm doing a novel, for me anyway, I should have done what he did, which is he just bought a bunch of how to write a novel books on Amazon. And he took the jewels from them, even if they were silly, like how to write a novel in 20 days, how to write a novel with your dog, Yeah. And I even just Save the Cat Writes a Novel. I really wish someone had handed me that at 24 instead of like a really beautifully polished, nice essay on how neat language is. Because my first novel took me 10 years to get into the shape that it got into before it was published. And I'm not saying it doesn't have flaws now too, of course. But just, I struggled so hard with structure, and honestly, just looking at a basic layout, whether I wanted to deviate from it radically or not, would have been so helpful. So my revision process is still there. Like the novel I'm working on now, I've been working on for 2 years. It was a short story collection. It became a piece of shit. Then it became a passable novel, then a better novel. I got an agent who was awful. We parted ways. It was good. And now it's gone all the way down to a singular point of view, and it still needs revision. And so I think, unfortunately, sometimes your process with revision is how much work have you done on the front end? And then also, inevitably, you think it's done and it's not. And sometimes you send it to an agent too early. So
it sounds to me like the more you have paid attention to plotting, sort of the elements of plot, and whether or not, the typical elements of plot, and whether or not you want to follow them or not. But the more you've addressed them in the beginning has saved you some stages of revision. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, or at least if it's a mess, it's less of a mess or a prettier mess. And yeah, I think so, because look, I might just give up on this novel. I've been looking for an agent again, and I, haven't been, I have signed with agents, and ultimately they were never able to get me to the big five or larger independents. But I might just give up on this novel. But I know this, that, the process, at least to get to where the novel is, where it stops no matter what, has been shorter and more efficient by far, and far less frustrating than it was for me initially. Part of that's just age and writing, but the other part of it is once I had a structure, people were like, oh, it confines you. It actually frees you up, because it frees you up to care about language. It frees you up to care about description and dialogue. And, once I kind of know the roadmap, then I kind of know where I'm driving, and I'm not like, driving drunkenly all over the road, so.
I had a similar process with my first novel. Same thing, where I could write an amazing sentence and I didn't really care about plot at all. But then people would read it and be like, what is this? I mean, this is a great sentence, but like, what is it? And you're right. I think in my process, I have come to the same conclusion, which is, if I do think through the plot, what happens, what this person wants, why they want it, if I just sort of cover those bases, then it opens up the ability for the characters and the plot to develop together, I think. So my other question with respect to revision is, what sort of advice do you have for the emotional side of receiving feedback from all over the place, right? And then trying to sort of like gather up your energy for another huge revision if you come to the place where you realize it needs one, right? So I feel like this is a huge impediment, and something that a lot of students and writers and everybody deals with in terms of revision. Like, do I really need to put in another 6 months to make this change? And there's this emotional side of it. So I wonder how you have dealt with that in your own life, or what advice do you give students that are struggling with that?
I think, unfortunately, some people are just a little more easily hardened to rejection, and some people are more emotional. And on top of it, I think, like, one of the things I tell my students, because they vary from middle-class white guys from the suburbs to young Black women from, different parts of the city of Chicago, and there's just no way around it. The further you get from an upper-class white guy who lives in New York, even if you're a farm boy, who's white, the harder it's going to be for you. And so and that's what kind of sucks, is that the criticism is going to be harsher for a Black woman or a Black trans woman by far. And the rejection rate is going to be much larger. And on top of it, it's going to be much harder to get to that point. To get to that point, you have an MFA, or you're a big reader, and you know what these magazines are and how they get you places. So it's deeply unfair. But if you get to the point where I'm there telling you, I'm like, look, you have to be a bulldog. Go ahead and mourn and weep and say to yourself when you get that initial rejection, like, F you. But then move on and see what you can take from it. And that never changes for me. My boyfriend's always like, why are you upset by my, complete slashing of your work? Why? And, it's because I guess I'm that guy, but I'm perseverant, and I get over it because I want this thing. And I think having a good peer group of people who, from at least somewhat similar aesthetic and or demographic backgrounds that can give you feedback is really invaluable. Because if you have a white editor or a white peer constantly going like, I don't understand this, explain this, explain this, explain this. And they're so lazy, and they treat Native American literature, for example, as a cultural lesson. And they can't imagine that the point of the story is just to read a good story, and the rest is Googleable if you're really that curious. Mm-hmm. Then how are you going to know when an editor is giving you good feedback or not? So you need to have and at the same time too, you should have someone someone you trust, but from a completely different aesthetic and or demographic background. So you can see what they might add, what might be coming for you. So I think that's really important. I still struggle to get that peer group.
Right. And how do you go about the process of deciding, let's say you get a whole bunch of feedback, right? And how do you go about the process of deciding which is worth incorporating into the next revision, and what is not. Because I think a lot of times we can get overwhelmed with feedback from critique groups or workshops, and not really know which direction to head for the next revision. Do you have any advice about that?
My basic rule of thumb is if it's about craft, it's probably worth looking at. If it's about content, especially if you are not that white dude in New York, it's probably more questionable. It's that, you've kind of threatened this person a little bit and they want to, but it's still really hard because I think you do need to set it down and look at it again, when it's a little more distant. The last, I just sent this novel, which has a missing and murdered Indigenous theme to it to some small degree. And I'd sent it out to agents, and I participated in hashtag DVPIT, which is for underrepresented writers. And this woman's assistant from Writer's House got back to me. She was just like, this is the most promising project we've had in years. I'm like, wow. Well, a month passes, and then I get this long critique, and she's like, how to write a great murder mystery is blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, but maybe this is on me. I'm literary. It has an edge, it has a plot, because I really believe in that. And I do write experimental short stories where I feel like that aesthetic is more containable and more proper for the size and the form. But for my novels, I tend to be more narrative, and granted, I fail, but I am still literary. The point is the characters' relationships, not like what will happen next, although I hope there's a bit of that. And the assistant kept arguing with me. Oh, we knew it was literary, but it was clear from her first email, she wanted a murder mystery. And what she was trying to do was get my grumpy, curmudgeonly urban Indian main character to be this plucky Native American Nancy Drew who solves the murder or the mystery of her own mother's murder. And for me, I tried to make it clear from the beginning, right? Like, this person knows, once she finds out her mom wasn't the jerk she thought she was, she does say to herself, I probably need to know what happened to her. I know she was probably murdered though. So it's not like, who done it? But so that's the kind of thing where I will go back to that criticism for the next round, but I'm not convinced when someone primarily sells crime, and I didn't write a crime novel, that I want to take everything she says so seriously. And it's really hard not to do that. As defensive as we are, when an agent says something, it's hard not to be like, I'll just do whatever they say and it'll get published. And, and I think that's why the peer group is really important. Like, Tiffany Quay Tyson, I love her work. I took a workshop from her, even though I've been teaching creative writing for 15 years, because I knew her novel was good. And she looked at a version of this novel for me, and I knew 99% of her critique was right. I just knew it. I just went in and changed it because she was just clearly so right. So,
yeah, I think it comes down to whether or not a reader, whether they are, a peer or an agent or an editor or anything, it comes down to whether or not they are helping you do that thing that you're trying to do better, instead of trying to get you to do this other thing differently, right?
Yeah, agents will do what they know to sell.
What's that?
And sorry about that. Agents will do what they know to sell, right? They'll try to get you to, and they'll chastise you because, oh, I could have sold this and gotten money, So anyway, sorry about that.
Yeah. So thank you so much for chatting. I appreciate it. I think it's time to call it good. Thanks for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.